A puppy has fallen in love with a lynx and follows her everywhere. The predator's reaction is incredible. What makes a predator break the main law of nature? The law that says, if it's not yours, it's yours, or prey. In the thick fern thicket on the edge of a cottage village, death itself stood still, silent, spotted, with cold yellow eyes. The shadow watched. Its ears, with black tufts at the tips, caught every sound of this strange, noisy world. A woman's laughter, a man's sharp voice, and a loud, shrill bark. The source of the bark was a black, clumsy ball of energy that was running across the perfectly manicured lawn. A puppy, a stupid, trusting creature that knew no real fear. To the shadow, it was just a moving target. Too close to her territory, too loud. But something in its carefree joy made her hesitate. Something made her just watch as it chased a red ball, tripping over its own paws. 10-year-old Lisha laughed as he threw the toy again and again. His puppy, Ugalak, was the greatest joy in his life. It was a birthday present that turned his world upside down. He had no idea that just 30 meters from their fence, the eyes of a ruthless hunter were watching his happiness. And that day would change the rules of the game for everyone. Before we continue, let us know which city you are from. We are interested to know where our videos are being watched. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave your rating. It motivates us to make new and interesting videos. Well, let's get started. The air trembled. Ugalak stopped abruptly, dropping the ball. His nostrils greedily sucked in new information. The smell of rotten leaves, damp earth, and something else. Something wild, primitive, and incredibly attractive. This smell overshadowed everything. Lesha's commands, the familiar world of the summer cottage, even the call for dinner. An instinct as ancient as the forest itself proved stronger. In an instant, the obedient puppy turned into a little wolf. He rushed to a low fence, squeezed through a familiar hole under the mesh, and disappeared into the green wall of the forest. Lesha shouted, but it was too late. Ugalak ran, guided by the smell. His paws got tangled in the roots. Branches whipped his muzzle, but he didn't notice anything. He ran toward his goal, not knowing what it was. He jumped out into a clearing by a forest stream and froze. On the other side, sitting on a fallen tree, was she. A large, no, huge cat, with spotted fur and strange tufts on her ears. She looked like a picture from his animal book that had come to life. There was no fear, only delight. Ugalak yelped happily and wagged his tail. He did what he always did when he met new friends. He clumsily fell on his front paws, inviting them to play. The shadow didn't move. In all her life, she had never seen anything like it. Any living creature that saw her either ran away in panic or prepared for a deadly battle. And this black misunderstanding was inviting her to play. Pure amazement flashed in her yellow eyes for a second. It was replaced by irritation. She let out a short, hollow hiss, like the sound of fabric tearing. The fur on her neck bristled. She stared at the puppy for another moment, then slid silently from the tree and disappeared into the thicket. Ugalak let out a disappointed squeak and rushed after her. But it was impossible to catch up with the ghost. Meanwhile, panic was growing in the village. Lisha ran to his parents in tears. His father, Dmitri, a pragmatic IT specialist far removed from forest romanticism, frowned. He grabbed a powerful flashlight and went into the forest, shouting the puppy's name. Elena, his wife, tried to calm her sobbing son, but her own heart was gripped with fear. They searched for him until dark. Dmitri returned angry, scratched, and without the dog. He was already imagining the worst. Late in the evening, when hope was almost gone, a dirty, tired, but absolutely happy creature stumbled onto the porch. Ugolak had returned. He brought with him the smell of the forest and a new, all-consuming obsession. From that day on, Ugolak was like a different dog. He no longer chased balls with the same enthusiasm. All his thoughts, all his feelings were there, behind the fence. He constantly sat by the hole in the net, peering into the forest and sniffing eagerly. Whenever he had the chance, he would break free and run away. Dmitri was angry. He saw this not as a cute quirk, but as a direct threat. The forest was a strange, hostile environment for him. He repaired the fence and reinforced the gate. But the puppy showed remarkable ingenuity. He dug tunnels and found new ways to escape. And every time he returned later and later, more and more exhausted. His pursuit became a nightmare for Tenny. Her hunting grounds turned into a circus. Loud barking scared away the hares. Clumsy footsteps warned the birds. She couldn't get close to her prey. Hunger became her constant companion. The predator's irritation grew. Once, she was hunting a roe deer. For hours, she tracked the young male, calculating each step perfectly. She pounced. And at that very moment, a black demon burst out of the bushes with a joyful bark. The roe deer leaped into the air and disappeared. The shadow struck the tree trunk in rage, leaving deep gouges. This puppy was threatening her life. She began to watch him, not as prey, but as an incomprehensible phenomenon. She sat on a thick pine branch, invisible to the world below, and watched. She saw him trying to catch a frog by the stream and splashing comically in the water. She saw him rolling around in last year's leaves with delight. She saw him fall asleep, curled up in a ball, exhausted from his fruitless search. There was no malice in his actions, only pure, unclouded love of life. It was so unlike her world, where every morning began with a struggle for survival. She remembered her kittens. They were just as clumsy and curious. Disease had taken them a month ago. The emptiness in her den had become unbearable. And this puppy, for some reason, he was reopening old wounds. One day, Dmitri, returning from the village store, struck up a conversation with a neighbor. Stepanik, a local old-timer and former hunter, listened to his complaints about the runaway dog and shook his head. "You, Dmitri, tie up your dog," he said, knocking out the pipe. "There's a lynx around here, a serious beast. Young, but experienced. I saw tracks by the old ravine. It'll eat your puppy and not even notice." Stepanik's words hit Dmitri like a cold stone. It was no longer an abstract danger. It had a name. Lynx. In the evening, a difficult conversation took place. Ugolka was put on a chain. Leisha cried, begged, and shouted that his father hated their dog. But Dmitri was adamant. "It's for his own safety," he snapped. The days on the chain became torture for Ugolka. He struggled, whined, and looked longingly at the inviting greenery of the forest. Freedom was so close, just a few meters away. He saw butterflies flying over the fence and birds soaring freely above the trees. And he was chained. His obsession only grew stronger. He did not understand the danger. He knew only one thing. His big forest friend was waiting for him. He had to find her. Shadow also sensed a change. The barking stopped. Silence reigned in the forest. At first, she felt relieved. The hunt was successful again. But then she began to notice a strange uneasiness. Out of habit, she went to the edge of her territory, to the same stream, and waited. She didn't know what for. The silence became oppressive. The absence of that annoying puppy created a void in her world. One day, while the family was having lunch on the porch, something unexpected happened. The carbine on the collar, bought in a hurry, turned out to be defective. Ugolok, once again desperately rushing towards the forest, simply broke free from his leash. No one even had time to react. He shot across the yard, darted into his old hole, and disappeared. Lisha cried out and ran after him, but his father grabbed him by the arm. "Stop! You're not going into the forest alone." His voice was as hard as steel. This time, the puppy ran faster than ever. He was drunk with sudden freedom. He ran along familiar paths, following a scent that was already imprinted in his memory. He didn't look down. The thrill of the chase drove him forward, toward the old ravine where he thought he had picked up the trail. Suddenly, the ground gave way beneath his paws. There was a short squeal, and the world turned upside down. He fell down into the darkness and landed on something hard and sharp. A sharp, burning pain shot through his hind leg. He tried to get up, but his leg was stuck between old, rotten roots at the bottom of a deep pit. It was an old trap dug by poachers many years ago. He was trapped. Frightened and wounded, he began to whimper, quietly and pitifully. The sun was setting. Dmitri and Lesha had been combing the forest for 2 hours. "Ugolyok, come to me!" Dmitri shouted, his voice breaking with tension and anger. Lesha walked beside him, silently swallowing his tears. He blamed himself. He hadn't looked carefully enough. He hadn't checked the rifle. They came to the old ravine. Silence, only the rustling of leaves and the anxious song of some bird. Hope faded with every passing minute. Dmitri was already preparing for the worst. And then he saw her. On the opposite side of the ravine, about 50 meters away, stood a lynx. She wasn't hiding. She stood tall, her silhouette clearly outlined in the rays of the setting sun. She was looking straight at them. Dmitri's heart sank. He instinctively put his son behind him and bent down to pick up a heavy, dry branch that could pass for a club. Lesha froze, unable to take his eyes off the predator's yellow, unblinking eyes. The lynx stared at them for several long, endless seconds. A man, a child, and a wild animal. 3 figures frozen in silent confrontation. Dmitri braced himself for an attack. He was ready to fight for his son to the last. But the lynx didn't move. Instead of growling or hissing, it made a strange, guttural sound unlike anything they had ever heard before. It was not a threat. It was a call. It shook its head briefly toward the thick undergrowth at the foot of the ravine, looked back at them, and then, like a shadow, stepped back silently and disappeared into the forest. Dmitri and Lesha were left alone, stunned by what had happened. And in the silence that followed, they heard it. A quiet, almost indistinguishable whimper coming from exactly where the predator had pointed. Dmitri stood rooted to the spot. His IT brain, accustomed to logic and algorithms, refused to process what had happened. A predator. A dangerous beast. It had just pointed out where his dog was. It was impossible. Absurd. Lesha jerked him by the arm, pulling him out of his stupor. "Dad, there! Ugolok is there!" His voice rang with desperate hope. Dmitri shook himself. Logic could wait. His son and dog, no. He cautiously began to descend into the ravine, clinging to roots and tufts of grass. The slope was steep and crumbled under his feet. Lisha remained above, clinging to the trunk of a young birch tree and keeping his eyes on his father. Dmitri approached the thicket where the lynx had pointed. His heart was pounding in his throat. He parted the thick fern branches and saw her. A dark hole, almost invisible in the gathering twilight. And from it came a quiet, plaintive cry. He shone the light from his phone. At the bottom, tangled in roots, lay Ugolok. His hind leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, and his eyes, full of pain and fear, looked at his master. Seeing Dmitri, the puppy tried to move and whimpered louder. It was risky to climb down into the hole, but there was no other way out. Dmitri tied his belt around the tree trunk and, clinging to it, slid down. The ground was damp and cold. He carefully freed the puppy's trapped paw. Ugolok yelped in pain. "Quiet, quiet, my good boy. We'll get you out now," whispered Dmitri, feeling the little body tremble. Pulling him up proved more difficult. He had to brace his back against the wall of the pit, lift the puppy higher so that he could get out, and then pull himself up. Covered in mud, with his hands scraped raw, he finally made it to the top. Leisha immediately rushed to the puppy, hugging him and crying with relief. The way back through the darkening forest was like a feverish dream. Dmitri carried the heavy, whimpering Ugolka in his arms. Leisha held tightly to his free hand. Every crack of a branch, every rustle in the bushes made them shudder. The forest was no longer a place for walks. It had become a living, breathing creature with its own laws, which they had so rudely violated. And somewhere in the darkness, the one who had established her own incomprehensible rules was watching them. Dmitri felt her gaze on his back, but did not dare to turn around. When they reached the illuminated area, Elena ran out to meet them. Seeing the wounded puppy in her husband's arms, she gasped. The next few hours passed in a flurry of activity. Dmitri, using his limited knowledge of first aid, made a splint out of 2 pieces of wood and a bandage. Ugol lay on his bedding, moaning softly, and gratefully licked Leisha's hands, who did not leave his side. Dmitri called the 24-hour veterinary clinic in the district center. The doctor gave instructions over the phone and told him to bring the patient in the morning. No one slept that night. Dmitri sat on the porch with a cup of cold tea and stared at the black wall of the forest. He couldn't wrap his head around it. The lynx hadn't attacked. It hadn't taken advantage of their vulnerability. It had saved them. Why? What motivation could a wild animal have? He tried to find a logical explanation, but couldn't, and that frightened him more than open aggression. Somewhere out there, on a high hill, hidden by the shadows of the night, the lynx sat. She heard muffled voices and saw the light in the windows of the house. Instinct drove her away, deep into her territory, away from dangerous humans. But some unknown force kept her there. The image of the whimpering, helpless puppy stood before her eyes. She licked her dry lips and silently disappeared into the night. The next few days were spent in the infirmary. The vet diagnosed a severe dislocation and sprained ligaments. No walks, complete rest. Ugolok, limping on his bandaged paw, lay obediently on his bedding. His trips to the forest stopped. The family tried not to talk about what had happened in the ravine. The subject of the lynx became an unspoken taboo. Leisha once tried to bring it up. "Dad, that cat, she's nice, isn't she?" Dmitri froze for a moment, then replied without looking at his son. "She's a wild animal, Leisha. We were just lucky. Don't think about it." But he did think about it, all the time. He started reading about lynxes on the internet, trying to understand their habits and psychology. But no article explained what had happened. Meanwhile, the summer continued to break temperature records. The grass in the village turned yellow. A dry, suffocating haze hung in the air. The local radio began to broadcast warnings about high fire danger more and more often. Sometimes, when the wind blew from the north, you could catch a faint smell of burning. Everyone pretended not to notice. They continued to water their lawns, barbecue, and live their usual country life. But there was a sense of alarm in the air, thick as the smoke from distant fires. One day, everything changed. The haze was no longer barely noticeable. It turned into a thick veil that covered the sky, turning the sun a crimson color. The smell of smoke became acrid and strong. It became difficult to breathe. Neighbors came out of their houses, talking anxiously and peering toward the northern horizon, where a column of dark gray smoke rose above the treetops. A fire truck slowly drove down the main street of the village, its siren wailing mournfully and alarmingly. Dmitri went into the house. "Gather your documents and the most necessary things. Quickly." His voice was calm, but the steely tone made Elena and Lesha act without asking any questions. They moved as if in slow motion, throwing passports, phones, and water into their bags. Ugolok, sensing the general panic, whimpered restlessly and hid under the table, tucking his injured paw under him. The alarm grew louder. The wind picked up, and now they could hear a distant but distinct rumbling. That was the sound of fire consuming the dry forest. A police car sped down the street. A distorted but intelligible order came from the megaphone. "Attention all residents! Urgent evacuation! Fire spreading! Everyone leave their homes and move toward the southern exit of the village." Chaos ensued. Car doors slammed, children cried, dogs barked. Dmitri carried out his bags and opened the doors of his SUV. "Elena, get in with Lesha. I'll be right there." He rushed back into the house to turn off the gas and electricity. In the commotion, the front door was left wide open. Ugolok, frightened by the screams and wailing sirens, jumped out from under the table. His instinct for self-preservation drove him away from the noise, to a quiet, safe place. Limping, he ran out onto the porch and hid in his favorite hiding place, under the thick, overgrown lilac bushes by the fence on the edge of the forest. Dmitri ran out of the house, slammed the door, and turned to the porch where the puppy had been lying just a moment ago. The bedding was empty. "Ugolok!" he shouted. Silence in response. He looked under the table and into the rooms. Empty. Cold sweat ran down his back. "Lesha, have you seen Ugolok?" he shouted toward the car. "No, he was in the house," came his son's frightened voice. Dmitri ran out onto the property, looking around frantically. "Ugolok, come to me." At that moment, there was a deafening crash from the north. A large tree had fallen. The sky above the forest flashed bright orange. The heat blew into his face. He saw the lilac branches move by the fence and realized what was happening. But it was too late. From the other side of the fence, out of a wall of smoke and fire, a deer, crazed with fear, jumped onto their property, followed by another. The forest was no longer a refuge. It had become a deadly trap, spewing out its panicked inhabitants. And his lame, defenseless puppy was there, at the very edge of this hell. Dmitri froze for a split second, his brain feverishly calculating options. But they all led to disaster. The fire roared, turning dry pine trees into giant torches. The hot air burned his lungs. Running after the puppy toward the fire was madness. Leaving him behind was unthinkable. Lesha jumped out of the car, his face contorted with horror. "Dad, Ugolok, he's going to run into the forest." Elena screamed something from the car, her voice drowning in the roar of the flames and the wail of sirens. The chaos reached its peak. Ugolok was trembling under a lilac bush. The noise of people and cars behind him frightened him. The heat and crackling of the fire in front of him paralyzed him. He was caught between two nightmares. And at that moment, through the acrid, suffocating smell of smoke, his nose caught a faint, barely discernible note. A familiar smell. The smell of a big forest cat. It wasn't coming from deep inside the burning forest, but from somewhere to the side, along the edge where the fire hadn't yet reached its full strength. This smell was his anchor in an ocean of fear. It wasn't associated with pain or danger, only with a relentless pursuit, with a goal, with something important and powerful. The instinct that connected him to the lynx proved stronger than the fear of death. The puppy made a decision. He slipped out from under the bush, crawled through a hole under the fence, and, limping, leaning on his injured paw, ran. But not into the fire, but along it, along a narrow strip of scorched grass, following an invisible guide. Lisha screamed when he saw his little black friend running toward the wall of fire. "No! Ugolok, back!" Dmitri saw it too. For a second, he stared at the tiny figure hobbling against the orange glow. All his logic, all his pragmatism screamed, "Run! Save your son! Save yourself!" But another image appeared before his eyes. A ravine, the calm, confident gaze of yellow eyes, and a quiet whimper coming from exactly where the predator had pointed. She had saved him once. Just like that. For no reason. Could it happen again? It was an irrational, crazy chance. But it was the only one. He made a decision that contradicted his entire being. "After him!" he shouted, drowning out the roar. "Elena, Lesha, follow me, quick!" Elena looked at him in confusion from the car. "Dima, are you crazy? We need to get out of here." "She'll get him out. The lynx. She knows where to run," he shouted, convincing himself more than her. He grabbed Lesha by the arm and rushed along the fence to where the puppy had just disappeared. Elena froze for a moment, torn between the evacuation order and her faith in her husband. Then she slammed the car door shut and ran after them. They ran along the edge of hell. On one side were their abandoned homes, on the other, a roaring wall of flame. The heat was so intense that it felt like their clothes were melting. The smoke stung their eyes. They ran, guided only by a small black dot ahead of them, which stubbornly moved northward along the line of fire. Ugolok could see nothing but the narrow path beneath his paws. He ran by smell, trusting it completely. He did not know that this path was made by animals, by the hooves of moose and wild boars, and that it led to the only safe place in the area, the river. The shadow raced ahead, invisible in the smoke. It didn't look back. It just ran, saving its life. It didn't know that a small black Labrador was following it, as if tied to it. And behind him were 3 people driven mad by fear. It just ran along the path it had known since birth. The path to salvation. Dmitri saw how hard it was for the puppy to run. He was falling behind. The fire was closing in on them, narrowing their corridor of safety. The crackling of trees grew louder. "Faster, Lesha, faster!" He pulled his son by the hand. Lesha stumbled and cried, but he ran. He could only see his father's back in front of him and trusted him. They had almost caught up with the puppy. Dmitri had already reached out to grab him. At that moment, a gust of hot wind blew a thick cloud of black smoke into their faces. For a second, the world disappeared. When the smoke cleared, Ugolka was gone. "No!" Lesha cried out in despair. The path in front of them split in two. One went slightly to the right, toward the river. The other went to the left, deeper into the thicket, where the fire seemed less intense, but the smoke was thicker. Where did he run? They had only a second to think. And in that second, on the left path, literally 20 meters away from them, a spotted silhouette emerged from the smoke for a moment. A lynx. It stopped, turned, looked straight at them with its inhuman eyes, and then disappeared into the smoke again. It was like an invitation, or a trap. "There, it's calling us," Dmitri shouted, turning left into the smoke. Logic was dead. Only instinct remained. They dove into the suffocating veil. Visibility dropped to a few meters. They ran blindly, coughing and choking. There was no sign of the puppy or the lynx ahead. Only swirling, poisonous smoke and an ominous crimson light shining through it. The path became steeper and steeper, leading downhill. They ran blindly, trusting the wild beast that was leading them into the heart of the fire. Hope gave way to primal fear. They were no longer in control of the situation. They were just splinters in a fiery stream. Suddenly, Dmitri, who was running first, stumbled and almost fell. The trail ended. Right in front of them was a steep, almost vertical cliff, and below, dozens of meters below them, the fire roared. They had reached a dead end. The lynx had led them into a trap. Behind them, the roar of the main fire was growing louder. In front of them was an abyss and flames. Dmitri turned to his wife and son. In their eyes, he saw the reflection of the fire and his own fear. He had led them to the edge of the abyss to save them, and now they would all die here. And somewhere in this smoky hell, a quiet, frightened whimper sounded. A whimper, quiet, full of despair. It pierced through the roar of the fire and the pounding of blood in Dmitri's ears. It was very close. Not below in the fire, but somewhere to the side. Dmitri crawled to the very edge of the cliff, choking on the acrid smoke. He shone his phone screen down. The beam revealed a narrow ledge, no more than half a meter wide, snaking along the sheer wall of the ravine. It was not a path for humans. It was an animal's passage. And on that ledge, 3 meters below, sat Ugolok, pressed against the rock and trembling with fear. And a little further, on the bend of the ledge, like a stone statue, she sat, a lynx. She wasn't looking at the fire. She was looking at the puppy. Then she raised her head and looked straight at Dmitri. There was no malice or sympathy in her yellow eyes, only calm, icy anticipation. The trap was the only way out. Dmitri turned around. "Lena, over here, I found it. There's a way down." Elena and Lesha crawled to the edge. Seeing the almost vertical wall, Elena pressed her hands to her mouth in horror. "We'll fall to our deaths. Dima, it's suicide," she whispered. "And there's certain death," he shouted, nodding toward the wall of fire that had already reached the edge of the ravine. "We have no choice. I'll go first, then I'll lower Lesha. You follow him. Hold on to the roots, to the rocks. Don't look down." He didn't wait for an answer. He swung his leg over the edge and began to climb down, feeling for footholds with his feet. Rocks crumbled under his boots and fell with a dull thud into the darkness. The heat from the fire behind him was unbearable. It felt like his clothes were burning. He reached the ledge. "Lesha, come on, I'll catch you," he shouted up. Lesha, pale as a sheet but gritting his teeth, began to climb down. His father caught him and held him tightly, placing him on a narrow ledge. "Well done, son. Everything's fine. Now your mother." Elena's descent was the hardest. She slipped several times, but Dmitri held her, digging his fingers into her jacket. Finally, all three were standing on the narrow ledge, pressed against the cold rock. Behind them, above, a sea of fire raged. Ugolok, seeing his owners, whimpered and crawled toward them, dragging his injured paw. Lesha hugged him, burying his face in his black, smoke-smelling fur. Dmitri looked where the lynx had been sitting. She was already gone. But he saw where she had gone. The ledge continued further, curving around the rock and disappearing behind a protrusion. "Let's go. Carefully. One at a time," he commanded. They set off along this terrifying path. One wrong step and they would fall into the abyss. They didn't think. They just put one foot in front of the other, clinging to the wall. Their hands were scraped raw, their faces covered in soot. They rounded the ledge and saw that the ledge was turning into a gentler slope, littered with rocks. And ahead in the smoke, the mottled silhouette flashed again. The lynx was waiting for them. It wasn't running away. It was leading them. The slope led them to the bottom of the ravine. There was less smoke here, and it was cooler. The fire remained somewhere above, its roar growing fainter. They walked along the rocky bottom, stumbling in the darkness. Dmitri carried Ugolka in his arms, and then they heard a new sound, not the crackling of fire, but the powerful, steady sound of water. A few dozen meters more, and they were out of the ravine. Right in front of them was a river, wide, fast, dark. The water became an insurmountable barrier to the fire. They were saved. Dmitri sank to his knees on the wet pebbles, unable to stand any longer. Elena and Lesha collapsed beside him. They coughed, spat, and breathed greedily, breathing in the damp, cool air. They were alive, all together. Dmitri raised his head and looked at the other bank. The forest there was intact, dark and calm. And on their side, behind them, their past life was burning out. He looked along the shore. The shadow sat on a large boulder at the water's edge. She had finished her work. She had led them to safety. Dmitri looked at her, and there was no fear in his heart, only an immense, incomprehensible feeling of gratitude. He wanted to say something, to shout, but the words stuck in his throat. What could one say to a creature from another world? The lynx looked at them with its piercing yellow eyes for several long seconds. Then, light as a ghost, it leaped from the rock, swam to the other side, and without looking back, disappeared into the night. They were left alone, on a deserted shore, cut off from the world by a river and a wall of fire. Saved, but completely lost. All around them was night, the sound of water, and the distant rumble of the burning forest. Dmitri hugged his wife and son. Their rescue had turned into complete isolation. They had survived the fire, but now they had to survive in the wilderness. And no one knew what dawn would bring. Dawn came slowly, reluctantly, seeping through the smoky veil. It illuminated a picture of complete devastation. The forest on their shore had turned into a black, smoking skeleton. Nothing remained of the cottage village except for protruding chimneys. The world they had known yesterday had ceased to exist. The Romanov family sat on the cold pebbles, huddled together. The relief of being saved was replaced by a dull, heavy despair. They had nothing. No food, no water except for the river, no communication. Their phones had long since died. They were cut off from the world. Dmitri stood up, brushing the ash off his clothes. His face, covered in soot, looked 10 years older. The look of an IT specialist disappeared, replaced by the look of a primitive man who had been left with all the responsibility for his tribe. "We have to move," he said hoarsely. "Look for a ford or follow the river until we reach people." He tried to head north, but after 100 meters, the path was blocked by sheer cliffs that dropped straight into the water. The southern direction was blocked by smoking, charred tree trunks. They were trapped. The day dragged on endlessly. They drank river water. Hunger grew more acute. Lisha sat hugging Ugolka and stared silently at the water. Despite his injured paw, the puppy behaved calmly, as if he understood the gravity of the situation. By evening, despair began to turn into panic. Elena cried quietly, turning away from everyone. Dmitri sat with his head in his hands, going over their hopeless situation again and again in his mind. He had saved them from the fire, only for them to die here of hunger, Lesha suddenly stood up. Ugolok found something, he said. The puppy whimpered and pulled him by his pant leg toward the thick willow bushes near the water. Dmitri waved him away at first, but Lesha was persistent. Sighing, he followed his son. Parting the thick, tangled branches, they froze. There, half submerged and stuck in the bank, lay an old tarred boat. The wood was rotten, there were no oars, but it was intact. A rope, more like a vine, still tied it to the trunk of a willow tree. It was a chance, a ghostly, almost unreal chance, but a chance nonetheless. The three of them pulled the boat out of the mud and branches. It was heavy and unwieldy. They scooped the water out with their hands. The sun was already setting, painting the smoky sky in apocalyptic colors. They had to hurry. First, let's get Lesha and Ugolka in. Then you, Lena. I'll push off and jump in last, Dmitri commanded, working at the limit of his strength. And at that moment, a sound came from the coastal forest that had survived the fire. A low guttural roar. It wasn't the crackling of the fire. It was the voice of a large beast. Dmitri froze. It appeared from behind the charred tree trunks. A huge brown bear. Skinny, with patches of burnt fur, it had clearly been driven from its territory by the fire. Its small, angry eyes fixed on the people. It was hungry, and it was furious. The bear slowly advanced toward them, shaking its head from side to side. There was nowhere to run. Behind them was the river. In front of them was the enraged lord of the forest. It was the end. Dmitri instinctively shielded his family with his body. Ugolok growled, crouching low to the ground, but his growl was like a squeak compared to the roar growing in the bear's chest. The bear reared up on its hind legs, preparing to attack. Its huge shadow covered them, and in that last second, the silence was broken by a piercing, blood-curdling scream. It did not come from the bear, but from somewhere above. On the rocky ledge that hung over the shore stood the shadow. Her fur was bristling, her back arched, her ears pressed against her head. She let out a furious hiss that turned into a cry full of primal rage. It was a bluff. She would never attack the bear. But it was the bluff of a predator defending its territory. She wasn't protecting the humans. She was defending what had become hers. This strange, noisy puppy and his pack, whom she had led through fire. The bear, already stressed, hesitated. He lowered himself onto all four paws, looking in bewilderment at his small but incredibly aggressive opponent. That split-second pause was all they needed. "Get in the boat, quick!" Dmitri yelled. He literally pushed Lena and Lesha inside, threw Ugolka in, and with one last effort pushed the heavy boat into the water, jumping in at the last moment. The current caught them and carried them to the middle of the river. Dmitri rowed with his hands, helping the boat move away from the shore. They looked back. The bear, deciding not to mess with the crazy cat and the strange creatures floating in the water, turned around and disappeared into the forest. Only the shadow remained on the rock. She watched as the boat was carried downstream. Dmitri, Elena, and Lesha all looked at her. Their eyes met one last time across the water. Silent gratitude on one side, calm, cold detachment on the other. She had done what she had to do. The puppy in the boat whimpered softly, saying goodbye. The lynx slowly turned and disappeared silently into its wild, incomprehensible world. The connection was broken forever. A few days later, a temporary camp for evacuees in the gym of a local school. The smell of chlorine, soup, and human grief. The Romanov family sat on mattresses in a corner. They had lost everything they owned, their home, their car. But they were together, Something in them had changed forever. Dmitri no longer saw nature as an enemy. He saw it as a force to be reckoned with. Elena no longer saw her husband as just an office worker. She saw him as a protector. And Lesha had grown up. Ugolok, with a neat bandage on his paw, slept at his feet. He no longer longed for the forest. Sometimes he raised his head and looked toward the distant, blackened hills, but there was no longer any puppy-like curiosity in his gaze, only wise, calm respect. In the evening, Dmitri went outside. He looked at the stars, which were once again visible in the clear sky. The naive love of a clumsy puppy for a deadly predator set off a chain of incredible events that destroyed their old life to its foundations. And on these ruins, a new one was built. He realized that the predator's reaction had indeed been incredible. She didn't kill them. She didn't tame them. She just gave them a chance. How they would use it was now entirely up to them. Who do you think showed more humanity in this story? The wild beast following its incomprehensible instincts, or the people who did not believe in the possibility of salvation until the very end?